cracking, a chorus of algorithms.
I know shape, I add, merge, I life change, I mutate, I fuse, heal, I chaos skew, I strive, reach, I save you.
Barbara Burford. See as she retrieves hearts and lungs at Great Ormond Street, tender silk brooches and necklaces inherited from those wealthy of life and flesh. This is the gift that makes her a goddess, a warrior of new chance, new hope, new blessings. These trinkets make her patrons saints. All it takes is this small donation, stored in cool canopic jars, carried by psychopomps in checkered white, yellow, green chariots into her theatre, where she directs, where she cuts. She opens children's chests like costume boxes, forages, brings out the worst in them to replace broken pieces with her own gleaming jewellery. See as she reaches in, places her love inside each slumbering breast, then kisses the lid closed. She is a poet, writing stanzas of healing in the skin, tapping a rhythm in the body's rhyme and restoring its ions. She is mother to them all. See as she cups them to her bosom.
I test you, I code break, I glass crack, I fire make, I lab burst, I star rate, I sing light, I world saint.
Alan Turing. It's thinking. Great ideas percolate in its arteries like trouble in mind. It's a great idea. Listen. The knack is a kind of sequestering. Watch. Invention tapers in, a glistening pristine, if given clear nights. Listen, it's alchemy taking place, inexact and on the wrong side, errors marginally clandestine, as with all things chemical and purely. He is riddled with love. Or can you hear the clink of coins about to change their masters? How many ways can we formulate grief? Sterling hope. See how the codes shift over the years, the words evasive gears. Run the algorithm again. If he saw himself today, he'd smile, giving us a bed, fresh from sharing, the rustle of sheets a twinkle in the eye. Listen, we can break. The same court diction now intimates Victoria's rest. Run the algorithm, see the photographs of him insist, archives, diaries, love letters stammer to attest that pure intent, a triumph. He doesn't struggle anymore, he just gets on.
I flesh shape, I form change, I ask state, I touch fate, I rule yield, I name take, I see field, I tridate.
Joan Roughgarden. You're born into something, and you either adapt, or change, or die. Sometimes nature gets it wrong the first time around, and to survive in the body you think God gave you, you have to alter certain traits. Imagine being a bird that thought itself flightless. Imagine there's always been an urge inside to jump from something tall, but that courage has been lacking. Imagine one day jumping. Imagine finding out that deep inside you were these wings. Imagine you found you could fly.
I wheel burn, I scorch fate, I fuse cure, I glove gleam, I cog turn, I learn mean, I find true, I feel real.
About another film from the DVD collection here. It's called Danny's Parade. It's a charming film about a 14-year-old boy from Amsterdam who's gay. Well, he's not from Amsterdam, he's from the Netherlands. And he wants to have a float for young people, young gay and lesbian people, at the Amsterdam Pride event. The Amsterdam Pride is rather special because, of course, the floats are on water and they go through the canals. And it's a delightful opening to the film because he writes a letter to his parents to come out to them when I think he's 12 years old, and they read it out, and his brother reads part of the letter out as well, and it's really touching and moving. as would happen, I suppose, if the same thing happened in Britain, he picks up the interests of the media, and some of them are not very good to him, some of them are quite hostile towards him. So he goes through quite a difficult period when he's building up the campaign to build the float, and eventually he gets it, to cut to the chase, and he goes under the bridge, and you see the boat come out on the other side of the bridge, and everybody's really praising them and shouting them and yelling them on in a supportive way, and it's really touching. So that's well worth a look. Okay, our next speaker is Dr. David Alderson. He's a doctor, he's an author and an editor of several books. He writes from a Marxist perspective, and currently he's working upon the assimilation of the word gay to establish equality and equal rights for LGBT people right across the movement, and how it works in the context of a neoliberal society and a neoliberal market economy and the conflicts therein. Okay, I won't say any more, I'll introduce him, David Alderson.
I'm very pleased to hear I'm not talking about any of that this morning.
I'm glad you do it.
I'm not a scientist either. I work in English and American studies, and in a way I think the very word science should be in inverted commas, because the kind of stuff that I'm going to be talking about today I think is largely spurious. But the point that I want to make is that there is an intimate relationship between the very category and the way we think about homosexuality and the history of science. And in particular, I'm going to focus on something that emerges in the later 19th century, given the name sexology. It's a word which is regarded somewhat archaic these days, and that's largely because we've superseded many of the assumptions which fed into its origins. It claims to be a scientific approach to the study of sexuality. It's surprising perhaps that during what was still the Victorian period, people were starting to study sexuality. But they regarded themselves as being progressives, as people who actually were enlightened in the kind of 18th century application of reason sense to the study of sexuality. And therefore they regarded themselves as displacing more religious perspectives on sexuality, which of course was still prevalent in the 19th century. The idea that sex is inherently sinful, and that of course some forms of sex are more sinful than others. Those, in other words, outside heterosexual monogamy, marriage specifically. And they develop their arguments through what we call case studies, through interviews with individuals who, as a consequence of being interviewed, seem to conform to particular types, who are then categorized as being particular types of sexual being. And they develop theories about sexuality as being either innate or acquired, hence these debates about whether people are born or become gay. Those sorts of debates really emerge in the later part of the 19th century, and largely in relationship to sexology. Now, many of their assumptions, as I've just been suggesting, are perhaps problematic, but as I say, they regard themselves as being progressive. Many of them support reform of the religious-based laws that still exist in the 19th century, known as the sodomy laws. Sodomy is, of course, a specifically religious term. But they do affect the way that we conceive of ourselves as being as sexual beings. And key is the coinage of the term homosexual as late as 1869. Right? That's when the word homosexual comes into being. And actually, heterosexuality is defined in conjunction with that, in response to that. The figure who uses this term first is a campaigner against the Austro-German sodomy laws, a guy called Karl Maria Kerpenny, who writes a number of pamphlets at that time arguing against the illegality of sodomy. His influence is relatively limited, but the terms get taken up by a very important, very influential figure called Richard von Krafft-Ebing, who writes, and you'll note the title here, a book called Psychopathia Sexualis in 1886. And the structure of the book and the terminology that's used gives you some sense of the way that he approaches this. One of the features, of course, of sexology is that it assumes that the norm is natural. That kind of sense that the norm, i.e. marital heterosexuality, is the norm because it's natural, feeds into their focus on what they regard as the more marginal or perverse, and they're the ones who start to use these terms, perverse sexualities. So, the categories which Krafft-Ebing talks about, and he's not simply concerned with homosexuality, include paradoxia, which is sexual desire at the wrong time of life, anesthesia, insufficient sexual desire, hyperesthesia, excessive sexual desire, and then paraesthesia, which is misdirected sexual desire, and that of course includes homosexuality. But nonetheless, there are all sorts of different foci in this particular book, including sexual inclination toward persons of the opposite sex with perverse activity of the instinct, masochism, fetishism, and so on. The category, and there are many proliferating categories around sexuality as part of this particular discourse, but the category that Krafft-Ebing uses for his chapter on homosexuality is antipathic sexuality. And this again is broken down into various different kinds, including the acquired and the congenital. There's a lot of speculation about the extent to which misdirected sexual desire is something that you acquire socially or something you're born with. And he breaks down congenital homosexuality into the following: psychic hermaphroditism, which is bisexuality; Urnings, who are exclusive homosexuals; Uranians was a variation on that term; and effeminates, he says, in which males are females in feeling. But one of the features of sexology, quite exceptionally in the 19th century, is that it does give certain kind of prominence to women's desires and to lesbians. Surprising perhaps when it's assumed in the 19th century pervasively that women don't even have desires, that actually there is this focus within sexology on lesbianism. And this is, again, how he talks about antipathic sexuality in women. And these are quotes from the book itself. The possible sources from which homosexual love in woman may spring include the following: constitutional hypersexuality, that's excessive sexuality, that impels masturbation. Hypersexuality also leads, for lack of anything better, to homosexual intimacy. Impotent husbands who can sexually excite but not satisfy. Prostitutes of gross sensuality, disgusted with intercourse involving perverse and impotent men. And he answers a rider: careful observation of the ladies of large cities soon reveals that homosexuality is by no means. So that's the kind of discourse in which this discipline is framed. But there are more, if you like, positive, well, they sound marginally more positive figures. One of these is Havelock Ellis, who's the first person to write a book in English on homosexuality. He's a physician and a psychologist, and he is actually married to an out lesbian, a woman called Edith Lick, a feminist as well. He married her in 1891. He co-authors a book on sexual inversion by a man called John Addington Symonds, who is both a classicist and a poet, and somebody who regards himself as an invert, another word for homosexuality at this time. They disagreed on the emphasis that should be placed on morbidity, but this is one of the ways in which it's described by Ellis. The sexual invert may be roughly compared to the congenital idiot, to the instinctive criminal, to the man of genius, who are all not strictly concordant with the usual biological variation, because this is of a less subtle character, but who become somewhat more intelligible to us if we bear in mind their affinity to variations. Symonds compared inversion to colour blindness, and such a comparison is reasonable. Just as the ordinary colour-blind person is congenitally insensitive to those red-green rays, which are precisely the most impressive to the normal eye, The invert fails to see emotional values patent to normal persons, transferring their value to emotional associations which for the rest of the world are utterly distinct. Now you can see there that the shift there from a rather unfortunate start is towards a sense of benign variation. But nonetheless, the assumption is that people are naturally like this. And therefore, if people are naturally like this, it doesn't actually make sense to have any laws against them. Right? So that's the logic of it. A more influential figure in the rest of Europe is a guy called Magnus Hirschfeld, a German sexologist, who studies philosophy and philology and then medicine and becomes a sexologist. He finds the first campaigning organisation in Germany in 1997 called the Scientific Humanitarian Committee. And it conducts, again, research. You wouldn't think that research was necessary of a scientific kind on homosexuality ban, but it conducts research and campaigns for the repeal of what was known in paragraph 175. Hirschfeld comes up with no fewer than 64 possible sexual types, ranging from the masculine heterosexual all the way through to the completely, as he puts it, effeminate homosexual. He founds another institute in 1919 called the Institute for Sexual Research in Berlin, and he also incidentally co-wrote the first film on homosexuality, which was made in 1919. At this time, of course, Berlin is a very liberal city, probably the most liberal city in Europe. Germany, more generally, under the Weimar Republic, is a profoundly liberal place in terms of sexuality. But of course, that isn't to last. With the emergence of the Nazis in 1933, the institute is closed down and the books are burned. Hirschfeld himself, who was Jewish, was exiled to Paris. I want to say a little bit more about his tendency to link homosexuality with effeminacy. This is something that was that led to a break in his own circle. Some people separated about this and said that actually it has nothing to do with effeminacy. There can be, as they thought of it, manly homosexuality as well, and they went on to celebrate that. And others, including people like Edward Carpenter, who was referred to earlier, celebrate the possibility that we are dealing here in homosexuality with something called a third sex, something which is not, strictly speaking, male and masculine or female and feminine. And what that highlights is the extent to which gender was bound up with these debates, determining the way that people think. They couldn't think outside of a model which is determined by heterosexuality. That desire for a man must be feminine, regardless of the sex of the person who experiences it. Desire for a woman must be masculine, again, regardless of the sex of the desire of the person experiencing it. So desire itself was understood in gendered terms. And this led to, all sorts of confused thinking. And one interesting point which has been made recently is that the category of the invert subsumes under it not only those people who we might now call gay, but also people who are transgendered, who are expressing a desire at a time when this was not possible to change sex, for instance. Moving on a little bit, I'm not going to talk in great deal about Sigmund Freud, but Sigmund Freud's work effectively is influenced by sexology, but departs from it in key ways. Freud did not believe that we were congenitally predisposed to become gay or straight. Freud argued that we became or acquired sexuality through our childhood as a result of a very complex and conflicted relationship with parents, one involving both desire and identification. I won't go into the full details of that, some of you will know the narrative that he tells. But it is a narrative, it's a narrative of development. Freud himself was very liberal about sexual matters. He was quite prepared to accept that there should be sexual variety, and indeed he theorises sexuality as being originally bisexual, which is to say undetermined. It's only over a period of time, only through socialisation that we acquire sexuality, and specifically in relationship to the parents. But what's interesting about the way that Freud's ideas become interpreted is that despite his liberalism, despite his generally progressive feelings, his narrative of development becomes seen as being prescriptive. This is the way that people should develop, not this is the way that people do normally develop in our society. And 20th century psychoanalysis becomes obsessed with the category of homosexuality, very much bound up with regulating it and indeed attempting to cure it, and comes up with all sorts of elaborate theories which are beautifully summarised in this excerpt from the book called The Homosexual Matrix in 1977, speaking specifically here of psychoanalysis. It is widely believed that a boy turns out to be a homosexual when he identifies with his mother and becomes effeminate. Or, by identifying with his mother, he later wants to repeat the joys he experienced with her by choosing boys whom he can treat as his mother treated him. Or, without identifying with her at all, his wish to have sex with his mother becomes transformed into a wish to enjoy the kind of sex she enjoys. Or, maybe he is really heterosexual after all, but is in love with his mother and wants to say true to her, so he gives up all other women. Or, loving her too much, he can have his sexuality prematurely aroused at a time when it has nowhere to go but toward other boys. Or, if she is a mean mother, he comes to hate her, ever afterward disliking and distrusting all other women. Or, whether he loves her or hates her, on discovering she has no penis, he develops a castration complex that forces him to turn to other males in a need for sex with Satan. So, psychoanalysis has its own peculiar way of tying itself in knots. I just wanted to end briefly by saying that, you know, this whole saga in a way of sexology and psychoanalysis, I actually think Freud is very interesting, and I think there's a lot to be learned critically from Freud. But you know, the whole history of sexology and of psychoanalysis has been an unfortunate one. It's only in 1973 that the American Psychiatric Association's Diagnostic and Statistic Manual abolishes the idea that homosexuality is a disorder. Nonetheless, the categories of psychology and psychiatry still govern the way that we think about sexuality, and the idea that we can be enlightened about sexuality still informs our own kinds of thinking about this. The very category of phobia, of course, suggests a kind of irrational psychological prejudice against someone, and that's the one that we use to describe various forms of prejudice. I'll just leave you with this thought. It seems to me interesting that we still rely on psychological terminology to describe debates about sexual freedom.